Hey guys, it's Cody. I'm on day 87 of the Odin project. Today I got a good bit done. I did not do a live stream this morning because I wanted to see how much work I would be able to get done without doing the live stream. Again, I'm just experimenting there, and I did get a lot of work done, so let's just dive into what I did today. So this is the final JavaScript project. You guys, if you've been watching along, I'm making these forms to actually create a process for allowing the user to add lexicon data, attributes data, and references data for those attributes and lexicons. For these series of forms, I have three main goals. One is to actually enter the data into the database. Another is to keep track of the lexicon and build the lexicon as the user is entering the data so that I can then show it to them later on to show them what they've actually done. And lastly is to keep track of which attribute they're on so that I can prompt them and allow them to see what they're working on at the moment and not just what they have done previously. So I did pretty much all that today. The adding data to the database is done for each of parts of the forms. So each part of the form actually enters data into the database, and then we do have some functionality to actually do tracking of the lexicon and building it, and then also keeping track of which attribute they're working on. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We're going to start in the add pages, which is the primary component that has this outlet that is going to be used to swap the different forms in and out. And previously we had this context to pass this database connection so that we could enter or get connected to the database and enter data with the database with that database object. In addition to that, now we have a lexicon and a modify lexicon that are being sent to it. So this lexicon state and this modify lexicon function, that is a callback function. We have a state that is being initiated up here, and it's going to be initiated with this new class constructor that I made. I'll get to that in a second, but the lexicon is again going to be passed, so then it's going to be accessible to each one of the pages, and then this modify lexicon is also going to be accessible to each one of the pages so that we can modify the lexicon as the user is entering in the data. But let's go back to this sensory lexicon. So I wanted to create some objects, some classes to actually create some hierarchy to my data and to better handle the methods and the addition of data and keeping track of these things. This is the sensory lexicon class that I created. We see that it has these properties: ID, name, product category, description, that correspond with the form over here. In addition to that, it has an attributes array that is empty to start out with. You'll see I have a lot of methods down here, and that was just because I was figuring out classes and I was playing around with factory functions too. I just was adding more and more stuff and just trying things out. But the main things down here are the add attribute, get attribute count, get specific attribute, and add reference to specific attributes. So the add attribute adds to the array with an attribute object. Get specific attribute searches the array to find an attribute with an attribute ID that is equal to the attribute ID that is the argument. And add reference to specific attribute takes a reference object argument and an attribute ID argument. It gets that specific attribute, and then it adds a reference object to that specific attribute. So we'll take a look at what that looks like now for the sensory attributes. So we have a sensory attribute class as well. A lot of properties here. Main one that's important for us to keep in mind is this references, another array. So now we're going to have lexicons with attributes with references, and we have some methods down here for actually manipulating the references. So adding a reference to the references array, getting the reference count, and then we also have a date modifier down here, which is something I'm playing around with to modify the date modified property. And lastly, let's take a look at the sensory references. So this is mainly just going to be properties here. So no fancy array to be added to this. There is a change date modified. Again, I'm playing around with that. I don't know exactly if I'm going to keep track of references and attributes. I think that will probably be best, but still to be determined. But yeah, this is the reference object that I was talking about for adding to the reference, the sensory attributes references array. So if we go back to our add pages, we're starting with creating this lexicon, and we're going to build to this lexicon as we go through these forms. So let's go to the first page, and that is going to be this add lexicon component. And we see that the DB, the lexicon, and the modify lexicon are coming through the use outlet context. Really where those become important is down here. We can see that we're adding data to the lexicon object within our try for adding data to the actual database, and then we're going to save that database locally with this state. So we're going to modify this lexicon object, and then we're going to use that lexicon object to reset the state of the lexicon with this newly modified lexicon. And then lastly, we're going to navigate to the add attributes page, but we're going to use some of this information down here and pass it along with using this state within the navigate function. And so we'll see what that looks like when we go to the next page with the add attributes. Then the add attributes, again, we see this use outlet context here, but where we're getting those previous product informations is the use location, and specifically the state that we pass to that navigation function. And so we're getting the product and its ID that was returned from the database, so that's why we're doing this. And this is for us keeping track of the lexicon that we're actually utilizing and reminding the user that that is happening. So let me enter some information into the fields here. Now we're going to the add attributes page, and we see that the product attribute was actually passed, so now it's in the title, so the user can see I'm still working on the pairs lexicon sensory attributes, instructing them to add the pairs sensory attributes below. So we're gonna add one sensory attribute, and that's what this component is going to be about. And so we'll type in, I'm just gonna keep these really simple so I'm not spending a lot of time here. So we have that data in there, and then once they click submit, it's gonna handle the submit, it's gonna get those values from those inputs, put it in the inputs array. Very similar to what you guys have already seen before. With the try catch, we're going to enter the data into the database. We're going to get the new attribute ID from the docref ID that's returned from the database. We're going to create a sensory attribute with this sensory attribute class, pass in the arguments for the respective fields, and then we're going to modify the lexicon by using the add attribute method to add to the lexicon's attributes array. And we'll pass that attribute there. And then we're going to modify that lexicon on the state, on the add pages state with this modify lexicon. And then that's going to be it for the attribute there. We're also going to pass over some attribute data, again, using this use location and navigation kind of combination. So we're going to pass the lexicon data and the attribute data there, and we'll see that in the add references. If we go top here, we see the attribute name coming through and its ID. We see the lexicon and modify lexicon down here. The attribute name is important down here because we're going to see that in the form. So if I submit this attribute, then it's going to say add a reference for the suite attribute, and that's where this comes in. So it's going to be dynamic data coming through so that they know what attribute they're working on, what their references they're adding to that attribute. Once they enter in the inputs, then they can submit the reference, and we'll see, again, it's very similar to what we saw before. It's going to add it to Firebase, and then we're going to create a reference, a new reference from that sensory reference class, pass in all of our arguments, and we're going to add that reference to the specific attribute within the lexicon using that specific method within the lexicon class, modify the lexicon state, and then we're going to pass the state lexicon data and the attribute data to the add references menu. So if I click this, we did all that. So we see we're still working on suite attribute, and that's what this is doing down here. If we go to the references menu, so we're getting the attribute name here from that attribute data. It's coming out here, and then the lexicon state that is coming through use outlet context. We're only passing that because we're not modifying data here. And we're going to use that down here to actually map over the lexicon's references for a particular attribute and then show those references down here. And that's what we see right here. Sweet attribute reference was added. If we add another attribute, which I'm just going to do silly, simple reference A, and we see reference A is showing up in here again. We can do another one, reference B, add it. So now we have a dynamic list, so the user can keep track of what attributes they've actually added. If we click finish adding references, we'll see this kind of crazy thing right here. This is actually an ID for the suite attribute. I haven't built this out, and again, I need to do some UI stuff for this, but the data persistence and passing around is what I was trying to figure out today, so I can then start styling things better. This is what we're looking at. We're keeping track of which attribute is added, and then we should be able to click this and go to adding another attribute, but if we click it right now, it's not going to work. I don't know why. Something's up, so I got to dig into that tomorrow, but that is pretty much where I got today with all that. So I'm actually entered data into the database. I'm keeping track of the form data as they are being entered and using those to create dynamic aspects of the form to allow the user to understand what they've entered and also what they are currently working on. So I'm pretty satisfied with that today, guys. Definitely interesting to see how much doing that streaming hindered how much I was getting done. I'm sure I could get better with it over time, but I don't know if it really is valuable enough to keep doing that going forward. We'll see. I'll keep it on the table, but for now I'm going to just keep on working on the project without doing the streamings and doing these vlogs and the weekly updates. But that's all I have for you guys today. So if you have any questions, definitely feel free to ask below. And if you're interested in following mine and Emily's journeys into web dev, definitely subscribe, and I will see you guys tomorrow.